Expedition 44, here with Pastor Matt and Ryan again. We are on Colossians 4. Matt, tell us, give us a recap from where we left off.
So we kind of left off with the household codes. So we talked about wives and husbands mutually submitting to each other out of their love for Christ.
Yep.
Basically children and parents, that relationship of fathers not basically exasperating your kids, which is kind of very much part of the culture.
And in our class, we just barely got into that, but the video kind of keeps going throughout the end of chapter 3 a little bit more. Yeah,
so in our last video, we covered all of chapter 3. So if you missed that in class, go back and watch that. So, we looked at slaves and masters, and why doesn't Paul outright abolish slavery? He tells slaves to obey their masters and work hard for them as if they're working for the Lord.
Yep.
And then tells masters to be nice to their slaves and to treat them justly and fairly because they have a master in heaven.
Yep. And he wasn't scheduling a revolt at this
He wasn't
point.
scheduling a revolt, no, and that's kind of the reason, because if they would have revolted, they all would have been dead.
Yeah.
And Paul cared more about the mission of the gospel than he did about abolishing social hierarchies.
And that's consistent with all of Scripture. I mean, we read in the Old Testament, people want the Scripture to speak to this and this and this, and it just doesn't speak to everything, and we can't really make it fit into our view. We have to accept it for what it does speak to.
Yeah, there's a whole list of issues that it doesn't necessarily speak for or against. God just kind of leaves them there and works with people where they're at.
He meets them where they're at,
Yep.
and I think that's really important to make that connection between Scripture and that. So, all right, so we're into chapter 4.
Yeah, we went up through 4 verse 1 last time. That's kind of where the masters and slaves thing ends. So now we're kind of getting into basically sharing the gospel through our conduct. So,
and we've said this before, but the places where your Bible makes divisions aren't really the best place to make divisions, and so this one starts at 4:2.
Yep, so we're in 4:2, and we're talking about prayer. So there's 3 parts of prayer that are kind of emphasized here. Ryan, what are those?
When I read this, I look at persistence, vigilance, and thankfulness. That's what I see it. When you pray, you could put those things out a few different ways, and I think Wright probably takes a little bit of a different view on that.
Yeah, N.T. Wright's a guy that you and I both will really like and think he's a pretty good New Testament scholar.
He's kind of our go-to guy in the New Testament.
Yeah, so he sees it as intercession and then watching for the answer to the prayer. Yeah. And then after that, when you see the answer, be thankful and grateful.
Yeah, so maybe semantics, pretty similar there.
Yeah.
And then there's this words of devotion, kind of, and this really fits with the rest of Colossians.
Yeah, so it's really about, we see this theme of allegiance coming up and being devoted to the Lord over and over through Colossians. We touched a lot on that earlier in chapter 3 when we kind of turned that corner from theology into application of being devoted and allegiant to the Lord. And here he's telling us to be devoted to prayer.
Yeah, pray without ceasing. And there's also kind of a hint here that it's not just devotion prayer, but it's kind of a big picture of fellowship too. And so sometimes we separate prayer from fellowship when throughout Colossians they're pretty interconnected.
They are.
So he talks about salvation here, and I think a lot of times we try to read into Paul's writing as if he's just instructing evangelists, as if he's kind of saying this over and over, that he's telling people how to get saved or emphasizing that, where really Paul is a huge discipleship guy. And so rather than overemphasizing or just reading little parts out of this and almost proof texting them, I think the way we've been reading Colossians is to read it all together, and rather than taking it as this huge emphasis of salvation, it actually fits more within the whole context of a step of discipleship within that.
Yeah. Scott McKnight also takes this view. So he's got a book called The King Jesus Gospel, which kind of re-examines a lot of the way that us as Westerners approach this kind of basically light switch theology, you say the prayer you're in type thing, and that salvation is actually a journey.
Yes.
It's growing day by day. Paul talked about being rooted before when we were talking in Colossians 2 and 3 about letting your roots grow deep.
Yeah. And again, we see this throughout Colossians where he's talking about discipleship, then he comes back to this, and we're going to get into this a little bit later where he comes back to it again, but after he talks about that, he kind of goes into this mystery of Christ language, and we've seen that before.
Yeah, we talked about in chapter 2. What was this mystery? The prophets longed to look into what was happening, and we see that Jesus coming on in the mystery was that God, working through Israel, bringing Jesus on the scene, is regathering all the nations, defeating the powers that were over them to make one people of God.
And this links into what we just said. Too many people put the mystery as just salvation. And if you do that, you miss a lot of what's going on in Colossians.
So it goes back to the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant was for all the nations to be regathered. God's one family in Abraham
Yeah.
So that's the mystery of how God was going to do it. The mystery was Christ.
Yeah. And then he kind of goes into this thing, pray that he might be clear. And when he gets into this wordage, there's kind of this idea that he needs to explain things with clarity so that people kind of respect the community or the fellowship here. Why is he emphasizing this?
Paul has a whole lot of concern, we see, and that's part of the reasons we have all these household codes of the way the Christian image outside of the walls of their home, and even inside the walls of their home.
Yep.
So that he wants them to be in the culture, but not of the culture.
Right.
So that's like with this. He's hoping that he can explain things clearly through this letter so that they'll be effective witnesses to those around them by the way that they live, and not seen as basically revolters or going so much against the grain of culture that it ruins their witness.
So this wisdom virtue thing, going back to the household codes, if the Greco-Roman world is looking at this, it looks very different. And so I think he's kind of speaking to, we need to keep our respect in this thing. As we're acting differently than they are, we want to make sure that they respect us through this and that we don't get some cult-like reputation for what's going on.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, we're moving on then to, in verse 5 of chapter 4, he kind of talks about wisdom and opportunities.
Yeah.
So we spoke on this in Job a bit, the kind of view of wisdom.
Yeah.
We absolutely love the book of Job, and really the wisdom that comes from God.
Yeah. And so he's dealing with wisdom from both sides as we keep going back from, and the world thinks that they're intelligent and they're the wisest people of the world, and very similar to the book of the Job, it comes back to just saying this is nothing in comparison with our God that we serve.
So Paul kind of knew this all too well, and Wright says that the importance of giving the world no reason to criticize or gossip about your behavior.
Yeah, that's a great quote. And then we kind of continue with speech, and there's a reference to salt, and that kind of links to discipleship there.
Yeah, so we see Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount telling his disciples and those listening to be the salt of the earth.
Yeah.
And so, what does salt do? How does this tie together? Because, salt could be used for a bunch of different things. There are lots of different images, actually, for salt. It could be kind of the spice of life.
Yeah.
But what Paul wants their speech to be salted, it kind of ties back to that big picture of discipleship. Not just winning souls, but the Great Commission wasn't just going out and proclaiming the gospel to everything, but it was teaching everybody to obey.
Yeah. So if you look at the Old Testament and you look at the rabbinical teachings and laws and things like that, especially when you get into Mishnah, you see a lot of this, that what the way the rabbis trained or brought up people was to have this almost like sharp going back and forth, and it was rooted in wisdom. And the word for that is attributed to salt all the time. And you see this with Jesus when they're asking questions to answer questions in order to show how much wisdom they have. And so that plays all into this, and we're not necessarily seeing this without understanding that culture, that when Paul is making this allusion to wisdom, it's kind of going back to that rabbinical teaching and saying they kind of got that right. And in theology, it seems so often that we try to shy away from hashing these things out. Like, I've seen pastors that don't want to have a conversation about a theological topic for anything, and then other pastors that just, they thrive on it, and maybe it's a medium in there, but that's really what theology is all about, is trying to fit it in with the context of your views. And so that idea of salt is really important.
Yeah, and salt's all about growth. We've kind of seen that. So interesting story from me. I was part of a missionary team before I moved to Wisconsin that was in Denmark and Germany, and we'd go into these boarding schools. We'd kind of have an in with teaching English and music, and then use that to talk to these kids about the gospel. And at one time, these kids all figured out that we were Christians, and we had an assembly that day that we were leading. But instead of kind of us doing our thing, they just grilled us about theology questions the entire time, trying to poke holes in what we believe. And some of the stuff, it was kind of frustrating because we really didn't know how to answer some of this stuff, and that's what really sent me down. That was the salt that sent me down this road of growth, of wanting to know how to answer, have an answer for my faith.
And that's one of the reasons that got me really into theology. Was I was a young youth pastor, and we had this guy that was in his 90s that used to be a professor at Harvard, and he was an atheist, and he started coming to our church basically because he liked the salt. He wanted to have these conversations. He missed those from his old days at Harvard, and so this is where he came. And like when he started coming and questioning him, I was in the same shoes you were, going, I don't know the answers to these. Like he's asking me questions I didn't learn in Bible college, and so like I need to get into this, and that also propelled me towards my later studies in life. So salt is good. This is a great thing. Yeah. Now he goes into all these fellow workers, and there's a whole bunch of names here. Let's kind of go through and outline who each one of these people were.
Yeah, so pretty much from verse 7 almost to the end of the chapter, we have Paul basically kind of recognizing the people that he's working with. So the first one is Tychicus, and he was probably chiefly the one responsible for delivering this letter.
Yeah.
He also plays the same role in Ephesians, if you look at Ephesians 6:21. And it says he was accompanied by Onesimus. So Onesimus is the next one that's kind of on this list in verse 9. Like we said, he's earlier in our other videos, he's a slave. And he comes up in the book of Philemon.
And that's where people kind of get into this slave Paul's view on it, and we just kind of go, I better leave that one alone, maybe.
And, I mean, Paul asks in Philemon for Onesimus to be released. And this isn't really basically a claim that all slaves should be released. He said it was because he was useful to him. So he needed him for the gospel work.
Exactly.
You and I don't take the view that slavery is good at all, but where you just kind of say that maybe this wasn't a thing that Paul didn't want an uprising in the empire, but Onesimus was useful for the spreading of the gospel, so he's calling for him to do that. So, so we see Onesimus, and kind of interesting, if you look later in the first century, there is a bishop named Onesimus.
So
maybe
could it be the same one?
Maybe Philemon did release him, and he became useful to Paul. Eventually, was a big part of the church network in this area.
I would
agree with that
view. That's a good view. And then we have Aristarchus, and we see kind of him later in Paul's ministry.
Yeah, we do. So he was basically a figure later in the ministry, being mentioned as a traveling companion in Macedonia. He was one of the ones that was arrested, wasn't he, in Ephesus, and that's kind of why I take the Ephesian view. Ryan takes the Roman view. Maybe he was transferred along with him.
There's a Thessalonica thing going on there too. So we got Mark.
So it says that it was his cousin, but actually the Greek word is his nephew.
Right. So
he was basically the nephew of Barnabas. Mark had kind of a checkered career with Paul. Lots of missions with him.
I think this is a good place to say that we shouldn't get hung up on those words, particularly the Hebrew when it talks about that, but even the Greek, which is more precise, because it implies family, and it probably implies physical family too, where when you see the word brother used, that's more of a fellowship family.
Kinship, fictive kinship. So we have Mark, who's also called John, and he might have been one of the ones who helped write the Gospel of Mark.
So good chance of that.
Then we got Titius Justus. So Jesus also called Justus. So Jesus was a popular Jewish name. So Joshua. So
who is this guy?
I don't know. There's a whole lot of different instances in here. So we got basically when the disciples are trying to pick the 12, the one to replace Judas, we have Joseph called Barabbas, which is also Justus. So that could be that in Acts chapter 1 there. There's a Gentile God-fearer in Corinth called Titius Justus. So maybe that. And
this is another place where we see this a lot too. There's these names in the Bible are always similar. And so trying to track down who's who, is this the same name, it gets pretty complicated sometimes.
So and a lot of Gentile proselytes might have taken on a Jewish name. And Justus, according to some historians, was a pretty popular Jewish or Gentile proselyte's name. So we really don't know who he was.
And then we have Epaphras, but we don't get much here.
We don't. We got more of what he was kind of at the beginning of the book, and we talked about him kind of in our intro in chapter 1, where Epaphras was kind of seemed to be the pastor of the Colossian church. But he's ministering with Paul wherever he is, Ephesus or Rome, and helping deliver this letter with Tychicus and Onesimus.
Now here's where these people get a little more fun and interesting. So tell us about the next set.
So we got Luke, who's a doctor. Likely the one who wrote the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts.
Good reason to go that way.
Then we got Demas. So Demas kind of appears a whole bunch of different times with Paul throughout his letters, but probably one of Paul's latest letters in the entire Bible, the letters to Timothy. We see that Demas who was a faithful brethren with Paul, and
we would get the idea that a very faithful worker.
Yeah,
if the Bible mentions your name here, it seems like you're up there. But now we get into this theological thing. What's going on here?
Yeah, we see in Timothy that 2 Timothy chapter 4 that Demas falls away from the faith. He walks away from Paul's ministry. So
theologically, that gets into this concept of once saved, always saved.
Yeah. So I'm like, if you can be a faithful follower, participating in the gospel, all of this for your entire career, working under Paul, being discipled, and then fall away, So there's a couple things going on here. We're not just talking about salvation throughout this book, that Paul's more into discipleship. So there's lots of reasons to put this on both sides of the fence. Is it once saved, always saved, or is it not? And when you get outside of the book of Colossians, it's still not cut and dry. Like, there's a lot of people that go both ways on this. I think there's scriptures out there that seem to clearly say both things. Yes, there are.
So you're trying to pull them out and go, which way do I look here? And personally, I don't think when I read the scriptures and I get into the language, I can't say that I would say one or the other is clearly the way. This might be one of those things we get to heaven and we just go, what's the answer? And some people even think that different writers had a different view on it, and that's very possible too. But when I step back, and I say this a lot when we're talking theology, that we don't get too theological sometimes, that we step back and we take a more logical, philosophical view of what's going on, and we say, what makes the most sense? And so at one point in my life, I was heavy on the once saved, always saved idea, and for me it was a viewpoint of somebody I was very close to, a personal experience that I didn't see it going that way, and I still in my life don't see it going that way. But not only them, but there were several situations of people, and we're not to judge people's salvation, and so this even gets a little bit more sticky trying to figure out where you land.
It is, yeah. Like you said, there's a lot of evidence kind of on both sides on how to parse all of that, because we know the Bible doesn't contradict itself.
Right.
So we're not going to give you all the answers here today. Maybe that's something you can dig into on your own. But
it'll be a long video.
It'll be a very long video. But it's definitely possibilities. Yeah. So that's kind of what we're presenting here. Is we got Demas here, who seems to be a faithful brethren, and then later Paul's latest letters. Yeah. Probably 2 Timothy is probably his latest letter. Yeah. And you have him walking away from the faith.
Right.
So
now we get another person.
Yeah. Now this is another one. Nympha.
Man? Woman?
Well, the earliest manuscripts say woman. There's later manuscripts that try to change the name to Nymphas, which is a male.
Yeah, and we're going to get into this in a second. This opens up a whole kind of question of early church dating in scriptures. And so almost all the early manuscripts would say woman here.
Yep, and I agree that it was a woman.
I do too.
I think the best manuscript dating and the best evidence indicate that. This kind of goes back to our husband and wife thing, that Paul's household codes wasn't that all women were, it was to wives and not all women, about the whole submission thing, you know? So what do we have here? The language could say that Nympha was the head of this church.
Yeah.
And if it's a female, then how does that go with the rest of Paul's stuff, where a lot of the times we interpret that in the West as that only men can be the heads of the church. But it could also be that it was in her house, but usually, since they were house churches, whoever owned the house was usually still the head of the church, from the evidence we have in the ancient world.
So when we do this, we're saying this is what it looks like, and one of the first things you do theologically, hermeneutically, is say, is there support for this in the rest of the scriptures?
Well, we kind of have leadership of women elsewhere. In the we like to connect Old Testament, New Testament. So we have Deborah, a judge. We have Huldah, prophetess. Miriam, leading worship.
And we got into this in the last video.
And then in the New Testament, even in Romans chapter 16, we have the potential of Junia.
Yeah. And we have 1 Timothy 5, where it says, it seems to say women rule homes.
Yeah, 1 Timothy chapter 5, it says for widows to marry and to rule their homes.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. It's the same word of like commanding a battalion or something like that.
So is that manage? Is that care?
Is
that rule? Is that command? It seems to me to be more of the latter, she's running this.
Yeah, so a lot of the times in the ancient world, in the home space, the women did kind of run the day-to-day stuff. The men went out into the public space, worked in ways of honor, and also which increased the family honor, but also provided physically for their family, monetarily and food-wise and like that, and the women who can rule the house.
One thing I love about Colossians is it just builds on itself throughout the whole book. I mean, it keeps going back and forth, connecting all these things. And maybe at first when we were talking about this concept of women in equality in the church, some people were like, man, you get all that out of that one little thing, but it's not just out of that one little thing. It's tied all over the place.
And now we're not promoting like ditches here.
Right.
Extreme feminism on one side or patriarchy on the other.
Right.
I think there's, like we said in the last road, there's a middle of the road view that we can take here and not go to the extremes like some people like to go to.
And I think you just come back in, and it really doesn't matter what your view on it is. If you read it the way men are supposed to act and the way women are supposed to act, we're going to be all fine.
Yeah, submit to God and follow everything the way that's lined up there.
All right, there's one more name here, Matt. Who's this guy?
All right, so we got Archippus. So we see in Philippians 1:2 it indicates that he has a house church, and that he's a fellow soldier in the Lord.
Yeah, I love it that he connects that battlefield mentality.
Yep.
We see that sports battlefield mentality, Greco-Roman, things going on all over there.
So I don't think it's saying he's an actual soldier, but we do battle together.
Right.
And this might be connecting back to prayer.
Yeah.
So,
okay, the last one is super fun. It's a lost letter. Tell us about the lost letter.
Yeah, so Paul says that after you read this letter, pass it on to the church in Laodicea, and then the letter that's there, that he wrote there, to read it in your church.
Yeah.
Basically.
So now it seems like this is lost, but then in the 4th century they found it.
Yeah, no. So there was basically apocryphal letter that they say was a letter from Paul to the Laodiceans, but it was proven to be a false writing.
Yeah.
So
what are our options? He mentions this letter. We don't have it. It's nowhere to be found. There's really only 2 concrete ways to look at it. What are they?
So it's either that it's an actual lost letter, that Paul wrote a letter that we don't have.
Yep.
And the other one is it could be the letter to the Ephesians.
Yeah. There's a lot of people on both sides of the fence on the Ephesians thing. There's great theologians that fall here, and there's great theologians that fall here. Why would you think it would make sense to go that route?
Ephesians seems to be a circular letter. It wasn't meant to be just to the Ephesians, just like as he's saying here. You can most letters, especially in the churches, what we know of in the ancient world, were passed from church to church and read.
Yeah.
So he's telling here, pass this letter on. Basically, or make a copy and pass it on. So that's one way that it.
And I think that's a good option.
It is, but the thing is, Ephesians and Colossians, like we said, they're twin epistles, and so much of the material overlap with each other. It's basically Ephesians is kind of an expounded version of Colossians.
Yeah.
And why would he just want, if you got this already,
right?
If you got the basics, the bullet point thing, which is kind of the Colossian letter, why would you just want to read the same thing?
And the introduction
right
to Ephesians doesn't seem to line up with that being that lost letter. That's the other thing that people kind of go, it would be what's easier to accept. It's if you're just looking at that part of it, I think it's easier to say, no, that's not it, probably.
Yeah. So the other option is maybe it's just lost.
Just lost. Now, this opens up what some people would call a whole can of worms.
Yeah. Inerrancy. What if we do find the letter? I mean, Colossae has never been excavated. What if we, there's the 2 guys from Australia that have permits now to do this. What if they find it?
Yeah. Now, a lot of people would say that kind of everything that Paul wrote, everything he touched his pen on. I mean, there's some people that believe that our Bibles have everything that he wrote. And again, what if he wrote other stuff? Is it all inerrant?
Yeah, what if he gave Timothy a grocery list?
Yeah, like a literal grocery list. Was that inerrant?
Or gave Demas a to-do list of things to pick up from the market.
Yeah.
I mean, are those inerrant?
So this gets complicated, and you get into the canon too.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. It wasn't until about 400 AD that we have something that looks similar to the set of books of the Bible that we have now. I mean, that's 350 years or so after Jesus.
Yeah. And these kind of start to come together even well after Paul. I mean, when you're talking about collecting all this stuff, I mean, it's a good 100 years later that people are starting to put that together. And really those first lists of what should be included, they're all over the place.
Yeah. So
is that a problem?
I don't see it as a problem necessarily. So I believe that God's providence has led us to have the books that we have.
Yeah.
We see that Scripture was put together by God's Spirit, working through men. And I think that His Spirit continued to work through these different councils and stuff like that to put together the lists that we have now of what we consider as inspired.
either you believe it or you don't. And if you don't, it's going to open up a whole bunch of problems. I mean, you know, what at that point, what do you accept and what do you not accept, and what fits and what doesn't fit, and everything like that. And you know, the words that we have, people when they were putting this together, I do believe were orchestrated by the hand of God, and that's where we fall with inerrancy.
Yeah, so Paul basically concludes the book about saying that he's in chains and to remember his sufferings, and kind of as an encouragement to keep going for the gospel.
Yeah. This has been a great study.
It has.
Yeah. You might have some questions. This could be the last film on Colossians. We might wrap one more up after this. We'll just kind of have to see. So some of you guys have emailed lots of good questions, and if we get a lot more, we might kind of tie some more things together here. But thank you for going on the journey with us. I hope you've enjoyed it, and may God bless you and keep you.